Welcome to the Gay Buddhist Forum, where teachers from all schools of Buddhism offer their perspectives on the Dharma and its application in modern times, especially for LGBTQI audiences. These talks are offered freely to the world and made possible by appreciative listeners. If you would like to support our efforts to share the Dharma with underserved audiences, please visit gaybuddhist.org. There you can donate, find a list of upcoming speakers, or enjoy many hundreds of these recorded talks dating back to 1996.
Okay, it's all yours. All right, thank you. Thanks. Nice to be here with you all. Let's see, unfortunately I need to update my bio. No, but I guess the details don't really matter. I'm just happy to be here with you, share the Dharma a little bit, and let's see. I thought today I would talk a little bit about the Brahma Viharas, divine abodes, loving kindness, compassion, appreciative joy, and equanimity. Just seems like always a good time to revisit those, to cultivate them in our lives. One of my main teachers has in recent years been Bhikkhu Analayo. He's a German monk scholar, and he has a practice that he's offered. Really, he's taking it from some of the Buddhist teachings in the suttas, but it's around compassion and emptiness, or the Brahma Viharas and emptiness. So we cultivate the boundless divine abodes of loving kindness, etc., and then we move into the gradual entry into emptiness kind of thing. So I've been, that's kind of where my practice has been in recent times, and I'm enjoying exploring that territory. And recently I was just doing a little extra metta practice, and then I went out to into the world, off the cushion into the world, and I had to take my daughter somewhere, and there was like in a parking lot, and it was one of those crowded parking lots where I'd get anxious because there's too many people wanting to park and not enough spaces. But I was kind of still carrying that spirit of metta, loving kindness, and kind of not worrying about it too much. And then this woman came from behind, she was walking back to her car, and she ran up and said, "Oh, I'm parked just up here. I'll let you take my spot." And somehow I just felt like the universe was giving back what I was cultivating more kindness, at least inwardly, and somehow it was coming back to me outwardly. That the world needs more of that. I have done a fair amount of volunteer work in the California state prison system. I really haven't been doing that since COVID. COVID kind of stopped that. People are going back in now, but my life got really busy, and I just haven't had a chance to do a whole lot of work lately. But wonderful other volunteers are carrying on where I was at Solano State Prison. But I do remember fairly early in that work, and part of the thesis of this whole talk is what the Buddha said in a sutta, Majjhima Nikaya 19, for anybody who's interested in that. But he said, whatever one frequently thinks and ponders upon, that will become the inclination of their mind. And so the Brahma Viharas are really interesting because metta is just the foundation for all. Each of the four have their distinct flavor, and I'll talk about that in a few minutes, but the foundation is metta, loving kindness, goodwill, benevolence, that kind of thing. And so having said that, doing the prison work, prisons are kind of an intense environment, as we all know or can imagine. And so we have Buddhist sitting groups in the prison. And at some point, the other volunteers said, we really need to lead some loving kindness. We haven't been doing that in this group. And I was fairly new to, that particular volunteer work. And I was thinking, oh, they're not going to really like that. It's a little too sappy or something. I was just worried it wasn't going to be well received. But the other volunteers said, no, it's really important. We need to do this. And somehow it's my turn to lead it on top of it. So maybe it wasn't So anyway, but I let it, you offer phrases and for anybody who's not familiar, kind of, then you send it to different people and so we went through the whole process and it felt like the whole room just melted into loving kindness. It was a chapel in Vacaville, not that far from here. And what was really cool was not only did our group feel like their hearts just melted and opened, they were all very sincerely practicing, maybe 19 guys or something. But then we also were meeting in a chapel that had a divide, and there was like another religious group meeting on the other side of the divide. And it felt like we affected them too. Because when our group, when the groups ended and everybody kind of had to leave, there were people from the other group coming up to me wanting to talk and really like as if they had felt the metta in the room. I can't really explain it, but it was a felt sense. It was really beautiful and touching. So all that to say, I'm constantly learning about how all this works, and these teachings are quite inspirational when I give it a chance. Having said that, I have this little story that I love reading. Maybe I should. It's by Laurie Anderson, who was you may have know who she is. It's I guess it's from a book called What Book? Buddha Poems from Beat to Hip Hop, edited by Gary Gach. But anyway, it says, don't limit yourself. In the Tibetan map of the world is a circle, and at the center, there's an enormous mountain guarded by 4 gates. And when they draw a map of the world, they draw the map in sand, and it takes months. And then when the map is finished, they erase it, throw the sand into the nearest river. So she kind of writes in a sort of poetic way. Last fall, the Dalai Lama came to New York City to do a 2-week ceremony called the Kala Chakra, which is a prayer to heal the earth. And woven into these prayers were a series of vows that he asked us to take. And before I knew it, I had taken a vow to be kind for the rest of my life. And I walked out of there and I thought, for the rest of my life, what have I done? This is a disaster. And I was really worried. Had I promised too much? Not enough? I was really in a panic. They had come from Tibet for the ceremony and they were walking around Midtown, Buddhist monks, Midtown in their new brown shoes. And I went up to one of the monks and said, can you come with me to have a cappuccino right now and talk? And so we went to this little Italian place. He had never had coffee before. So he kept talking faster and faster. And I kept saying, look, I don't know whether I promised too much or too little. Can you help me, please? And he was really being practical. He said, look, don't limit yourself. Don't be so strict. Open it up. He said, the mind is a wild white horse, and when you make a corral for it, make sure it's not too small. And another thing, when your house burns down, just walk away. And another thing, keep your eyes open. And one more thing, keep moving, because it's a long way home. So that always speaks to me in many ways. And just love that idea that, before I knew it, I promised to be kind for the rest of my life, which, but that is kind of what the Buddha was pointing us towards. And metta is a counterbalance to anger as well, to anger, ill will. So if we're feeling anger, ill will about anything, say things going on in the world, Buddha would say we could cultivate metta, and but also the loving kindness, also compassion, also the sympathetic joy when appropriate, and then lastly, but perhaps most importantly, equanimity. So probably going to talk here at the back end of the talk more about equanimity, which I think is a really interesting one. But let's see, there's a poem I wanted to read by Kobayashi Issa, a Japanese poet from the 1800s, and it's very short. I'm going to roll over, so please move, cricket. But just this idea that, we're with the practice, we are changing our orientation towards the world potentially, and, looking at ways to be kind. I've heard one thing that happens with the prison work, you hear guys start talking about things like crickets, that they start tuning into the creatures great and small in the prison area, and give great attention to saving the life of, say, a cricket that people are going to step on otherwise. And I love hearing those stories. So let's see. So Venerable Analayo talks about the Brahma Viharas in a slightly different way than I maybe heard other teachers, which is one reason I thought I'd mention it. And also it talks about how metta, loving kindness, it's a mental attitude of mind, that we're cultivating. And somehow I hadn't thought about it quite that way before. He says in the early discourses, and he's all about early Buddhism, so this is kind of an early Buddhist take on the Brahma Viharas. He says, in the early discourses, metta is the most frequently mentioned Brahma Vihara, described in various ways and contexts. Underlying this emphasis on the first of the four Brahma Viharas is its foundational role for the cultivation of the other three. It functions as a condition or root of the other three. For example, one of the suttas compares metta, loving kindness, to the water that nourishes the root of the tree of compassion. And in this foundational role, metta can find expression through bodily, verbal, and mental activities. So it's also, always good to remember that karma, mental activity is included in karma. Bodily, verbal is, has maybe bigger repercussions, but the mind does matter. It is included, which can be a little scary at times, or it's worth keeping in mind. No pun intended. Notably, metta is the only Brahma Vihara whose broad range of application by way of bodily, verbal, and mental activities is explicitly highlighted in the early discourses. By covering the entire range of possible interactions with others, so it's meant to cover the entire range, including emails, texts, etc. Now it thus provides the testing ground for one's meditation practice. Thought that was an interesting thing to think about. So, and one thing I like about the Laurie Anderson story is nobody's saying we have to do this perfectly, that we're going to have our good moments and bad moments. We know that. And so we also have to have, compassion for ourselves when maybe we don't remember some of these, don't have the kindest possible response. But one of the keys, of course, mindfulness is key to everything in practice all the time, right? So it's very important, even when we do kind of lose it and get a little angry and say something we regret, it's important to keep mindful even through that, and to notice how that affected me when I just allowed myself to say something out of anger. Venerable Analayo, one interesting thing about him is he talks about how he is an anger type. So he's had to work really hard with all this, which I relate to because I have had anger issues myself in the past. In particular, I can't, these things it is part of my issue too. But one thing Venerable Analayo said on a call just the other day was anger. Somebody brought up that their boundaries had been violated by another person where they were living, and they were very upset about it. And I guess they're looking for some validation for their anger or something. And Venerable Analayo said, he said the word anger 3 times for some reason. He said, anger, anger, anger is a problem. It can never be a solution. I just thought that was really, it's very simple, but powerful. And so kind of the idea is that we wait till the anger has subsided, and then so that we can then act out of from that place of equanimity that we're going to talk about, where we've come back down from that place of anger. I mean, for me, this practice, has been one of the great benefits of my meditation practice, is learning how to work with anger. And I tell this story a lot. I think we have time. I'm partially reminded of it because we're in San Francisco, and it happened in San Francisco. But so I was introduced to, Jack Kornfield at Spirit Rock in 1993. And I thought everything he said resonated and was a great idea. And, we should all be doing this practice. But I was pretty busy with my, life, and things were going okay. So it wasn't until 12 years later, when I was going through a tough time, and was like struggling in employment issues, and was basically going through a divorce, and kind of hitting a low point in my life. And I started to think, well, things are not going well here. Like, what could I do to maybe turn this around? And I remembered, well, Jack Kornfield's always talking about these meditation retreats. Maybe I should try one of those. So I was literally just desperate enough to go on a meditation retreat. And I went on my first, it was a men's retreat I don't think they do those anymore. It was an all men's retreat at Spirit Rock for 5 days. But it really, I call it going pro when you go on retreat, because all you do all day is practice meditation and, mindfulness, in theory anyway. So I had a pretty good retreat, learned a lot. And at the time, my future ex-wife and I had 2 dogs, 2 miniature dachshunds. And she was living in my old apartment in Pacific Heights. I was now supplanted somewhere else. And long story short, I had asked her to watch my dog. We had split the dogs in 2 when we were through the breakup or whatever. And so I asked her if she could watch my dog. It was just like the natural, wasn't really planning this very well. So as soon as the retreat was over, I had to drive from Marin over the Golden Gate Bridge to my old apartment to pick up my dog. And as soon as I got there, she started kind of pushing my buttons. Like, she's like, oh, you were on a meditation retreat? And she saw that I had this new string. I just happen to have one right now, like that they gave us a protection cord, which I was feeling really good about, but she was attacking my precious protection cord, whatever. So I noticed I was starting to get a little agitated. And I said, hold on a minute, I need to go to the restroom. So I went to the bathroom and just came back to the breath, sat for a minute and just paused. I was like, oh boy, this is starting to get contentious already. But it was really amazing. And this has never happened since, but I had an actual vision of the energy of anger starting to come up the base of my spinal cord, like mercury in a thermometer. Like I sort of almost had a visualization of the anger, and I just saw it. It was like, oh wow, it's here comes the mercury or whatever. And but I was able to just be with it, and it wasn't like I was even wanting it to go away, but I was able to just breathe and just come back to zero, kind of. And then I was like, oh, okay, now I'm okay. And then I went back out and had some pleasantries, took my dog Popeye and left. But that was a great lesson for me. It's like I didn't have to get caught by the anger. I had found a way to work with it. And so that is kind of what Venerable Analayo is recommending we do. And I know Thich Nhat Hanh says, if you're really angry, just lie down. Don't do anything. Just lie down until you feel better. So anyway, taking a look at my notes here that, I mean, there's so much we could say about, metta, loving kindness. I think we've probably all heard a lot of it. Well, one thing that Bhikkhu Nalio says, there are many benefits of cultivating the Brahma Viharas, starting with metta as a foundation. One of them is they are the cause of happiness and considered it, quote, an acquisition of a mental condition that is comparable to wealth. Comparable to wealth. So they're kind of a Buddhist idea of wealth is to be filled with the Brahma Viharas. In addition to transforming one's own mind, the practice of compassion, for example, also has positive effects on others. So obviously, if we are genuinely cultivating this, it has a positive effect on those around us. And I do remember after that event happened, that first retreat, I went on another retreat. I got a job at Spirit Rock, and I went all in. And after, I can't remember, maybe 8 or 10 years later, one of my closest friends who I'd known for quite a while just looked at me one day and said, "What happened to all your anger? You've really changed." But it was a really beautiful confirmation that things were going in a much better direction. And it affected him. You realize that he's feeling better too, right? Because he doesn't have to worry about his Walt get upset. And I have to tell him some bad news or something, whatever it was that used to trigger me. The third one is antidote to anger. So we've covered that. The fourth one that Venerable Analaya mentioned here was an attitude of metta is also the best way to proceed when one has to reprimand or criticize another, which should not be done with an angry mind. And fifth, it said, a mind well cultivated in metta is supreme in beauty. So if we want to beautify ourselves in some way, fill ourselves with metta, if you're going about it the Buddhist way anyway. So Jack Kornfield would always talk about people would go on the 2-month retreat at Spirit Rock and come out of it with what he called the Vipassana facelift. People would be just glowing, and you did feel like their faces were kind of more open. I mean, it was great because I worked there for 7 years. So I would always love that time when that retreat ended and people would come out and they'd kind of come into the office to talk to whoever they could get a hold of and talk for 2 months. And it was really wonderful to just see these folks and talk to them. And you could just see they were kind of beaming. The other key thing here that Ajahn Jayasaro, a monk in the Thai forest tradition, writes, metta is a pure love because it's free of attachment to the idea of self. With metta, we want nothing other than the happiness of living beings. Metta is love, and this is idealistic version. Metta is love which flows out naturally from a fulfilled mind, rather than an agitation in a mind that lacks refuge. Metta wishes for nothing in return, not even love or understanding. The Buddha said that the unconditional love a mother bears for her only child is the closest approximation to this love in the world at large. But for the one who cultivates metta, that love is not restricted to one's child, but is felt for all that lives. So we end around noon.
Right, yeah. And about 5 minutes till noon.
Okay, great. So I also like to share, so when I'm offering the metta, we're not going to do the metta practice today, but when I'm offering it, I like to share stories of kindness to kind of warm up our hearts. I thought I would I'll give you a couple examples. This was from a Reader's Digest thing. When I was a kid, my parents always had a Reader's Digest, and I just remember how I love parts of it. So this is just a touching kindness of strangers. Two firefighters were waiting in line at a fast food restaurant when the siren sounded on their fire truck parked outside. As they turned to leave, a couple who had just received their order handed their food to the firefighters. The couple then got back in line to reorder. Doubling down on their selfless act, the manager refused to take their money. Driving home in a blizzard, I noticed a vehicle trailing close behind me. Suddenly, my tire blew. I pulled off the road and so did the other car. A man jumped out from behind the wheel and without hesitation changed the flat. I was going to get off 2 miles back, he said, but I didn't think that tire looked good. So kind of amazing. And then just one more. As I walked through the parking lot, all I could think about was the dire diagnosis I had handed my patient Jimmy, pancreatic cancer. Just then, I noticed an elderly gentleman handing tools to someone working under his stalled car. That someone was Jimmy. Jimmy, what are you doing? I yelled out. Jimmy dusted off his pants. My cancer didn't tell me not to help others, Doc. Before waving at the old man to start the car, the engine roared to life, and the man thanked Jimmy and drove off. Then Jimmy got into his car and took off. Take-home message: kindness has no limits and no restrictions. So, the last thing I'll say, because I just thought this was interesting, was in the suttas, there's a discourse that says that, let's see, what does it say? Superior to offering food to 100 stream enterers or 100 once returners or like enlightened people, or to constructing a monastery and giving it to the monastic community of the four directions, or superior to taking refuge with the joyful mind in the Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha, etc. Would it be if one were to dwell with a mental attitude of metta toward all living beings just for the brief time it takes to milk a cow? Just thought that was interesting, that it's like people do a lot of things for merit and whatnot, and the best thing you can do is to keep that attitude for, I don't know how long it takes to milk a cow exactly. All right, so that's a little bit about metta, which is the foundation, so we have to spend some time on it. And then we move to, I mean, there's much more that could be said about metta. We move to compassion, karuna. The near enemy is said to be pity, and the opposite is cruelty. And this is where metta meets suffering, right? That's compassion. And but what's interesting is the way Venerable Analayo talks about it, and he says, this is it, his interpretation from the early discourses, is that it's the idea is that we wish for the people to be free from suffering and the causes of their suffering, but that this can actually be joyful. If we're wishing for you, whoever you are, to be free of the causes of your suffering, this could actually bring us joy. In other words, it doesn't have to bring us down into the depths of sadness and the pity of the near enemy, that it can still have an uplifting quality. So I just thought that was interesting. But an essential component of compassion, according to Venerable Analayo, is the concern for others to be relieved from suffering and affliction. A subtle but important point is that the mere act of seeing the actual suffering is not compassion. Compassion is concerned with the other person being free from the suffering. The cultivation of compassion finds its expression in the wish for the other to be free from dukkha, from suffering. In this way, the mind takes the vision of freedom from affliction as its object, resulting in a positive, even joyful state of mind instead of sadness. So we're kind of imagining this person being free from their suffering, and that's the object, so again, that's not always the way it's taught, but I just think that's a really interesting take on this particular Brahma Vihara. So therefore, compassion doesn't mean to commiserate to the extent of suffering along with the other person. And then he adds, ideally, we do proceed from the opening of the heart that's genuinely receptive to the pain and suffering of others, to the positive mental condition of being filled with the wish for others to be free from the affliction and suffering. And goes without saying, compassion is directly opposed to the wish for others to be harmed. So that's just it's often said that like the biggest example of compassion in the ancient Buddhist world was that the Buddha taught out of compassion. That was his reason for offering the teachings, because he saw that people were suffering and that he felt he had a way to resolve their suffering, to help resolve their suffering. Compassion is, later ideas in Buddhist thought did evolve in a slightly different way, so you may have heard it differently. I just wanted to offer that take on it as one way to look at how you could practice with compassion. Then we get to mudita, sympathetic joy. The near enemy is said to be worldly happiness, and the opposite of mudita is envy, jealousy, discontent. And it's the feeling of happiness at the success and good fortune of others generally. But what's interesting to me is that according to the way, again, Bhikkhu Analayo offers it, is that it's really about taking joy when we see others reap the fruits of their wholesome actions. So it's when we realize that somebody's doing something that's really wholesome and positive. So it's not necessarily you won the lottery and I feel so happy for you. We actually know from studies that a lot of people that win the lottery, their life gets worse within like 10 years or whatever. They kind of like spend all the money and then things go downhill. So it's not always anyway. So I just find that to be very easy to get behind, like in the 12-step recovery world, people celebrate each other's, I have 30 days clean and sober and everybody claps or whatever, but it's because, based on knowing where they came from, what suffering they were doing, and then they're looking better, we're seeing wholesome benefits. We can really feel true empathetic joy for that person, right? So this is the kind of thing that mudita is, when metta meets somebody reaping the fruits of their wholesome actions. I found that to be a useful little fine-tuning of my own understanding of what it meant.
Could you repeat that? That sounds important.
Sure. Well, just this idea that the mudita, sympathetic joy, we're rejoicing when we see somebody reap the fruits of their wholesome actions, as opposed to just being happy for them because they got a part on a TV sitcom or whatever, it's, which is great. I'm not saying you shouldn't be happy for, but the idea, as I'm understanding it, it was more about really rejoicing when we see somebody on the path of liberation. You would say, like, you could say the path of healing, that kind of thing.
Right.
Yeah, sure. So let's see, time is running out. Well, I also thought it was interesting that the early discourses explicitly set sympathetic joy in contrast to discontent. This contrast can be seen in the listing of elements of release. Let's see, this is hard to explain. But anyway, this idea that it's sort of the opposite of discontent as well. We can just, if we're genuinely happy, again, it's a test of our own practice. If our practice is going well and we feel grounded, good in ourselves, and it's not that difficult to feel happy rather than envious when something good happens for others. So let's see, then the last one is upekkha, the equanimity. I wanted to have a little time on this. So the near enemy of this is apathy or indifference, and the opposite would be greed and resentment. And Bhikkhu Analayo says equanimity or equipoise, from an etymological perspective, suggests a mental attitude of looking upon, not an indifferent looking away. So it's the metta is still there, which I think is important to remember. There's a warmth that's still present, even, and we're looking upon, we're not looking away on whatever is happening. The term thus conveys an awareness of whatever's happening, combined with mental balance and the absence of favoring or opposing. So it gives us that ability to look upon without sort of needing it to go a certain way. Let's see. And what's interesting to me that he brings up for this one is when compassionate activity meets with a careless or cold response, then perhaps the time has come to move on to equanimity. This requires giving up attempts to control the situation and change it for the better. This is Bhikkhu Analayo writing. And then he says, instead, one allows others to take responsibility for their own actions and attitudes. In this way, equanimity can indeed round off compassion by liberating compassionate activity from the expectation of results. So we act with compassion, but then we have to let it go at some point. We can't control what other people do or say. I mean, again, I am, part of my path has been a recovery from alcoholism and addiction. And so I see, I talked about, you could have the mudita, sympathetic joy, when somebody's kind of doing well and staying sober, but the opposite happens where people start drinking again, and you can offer them a lot of different types of help, and they still may or may not take it for whatever reason. And it can be very heartbreaking if we don't have this practice, this equanimity to kind of help keep us balanced in the face of it. And that we have to, like he says, we have to, like the prayer in equanimity would be, may they take responsibility for their actions. Just as I need to take responsibility for my actions, may that person take responsibility for their actions. So this is kind of the way we cultivate equanimity, if you need a phrase. And I find this to be a useful sort of practical way to work with this one that I have been using. And I've had friends start drinking again and using whatever, and who just never came back to recovery and ended up dying as a result of what they were doing. And there's just, nothing I did helped. And so that's just the way it goes sometimes. And there is a story in the sutta somewhere where there's basically a drunk who is the cousin of somebody that close to the Buddha, and this person's like a wealthy benefactor of the Buddha, and that guy tries everything to help his, like a first cousin, I think it is, or something. But the person takes the money, just keeps taking advantage of the guy. And then he finally goes to the Buddha and says, what do I do? And then the Buddha says something like, some people just can't be helped. And that's kind of what we're talking about. So it's a realistic thing, I guess. And then I'll end with one of my favorite stories from the suttas, or at least something I really like, which is there's a sutta where this Brahmin, which, so somebody of status in ancient India comes to the Buddha. I was trying to understand who this person was, but he was somebody's little brother, younger brother. And I get the idea that maybe his older brother had ordained under the Buddha and he didn't like it because it was going to take him away from their way of life, maybe. So this guy comes up to the Buddha. He said he's angry and displeased. They don't really explain why, but they say angry and displeased. The Brahmin approached the Blessed One, the Buddha, and abused and reviled him with rude, harsh words. And the Blessed One said to him, "What do you think, Brahmin? Do your friends and colleagues, kinsmen and relatives, as well as guests come to visit you?" And the guy says, "Sometimes they come to visit, Master Gautama. And do you offer them some food or a meal or a snack?" "Sometimes I do, Master Gautama. But if they do not accept it from you, then to whom does the food belong?" The guy thinks about it and says, "Well, if they don't accept it from me, then the food still belongs to us." I guess it's family. And then the Buddha says, "So too, Brahman, we who do not abuse anyone, who do not scold anyone, who do not rail against anyone, we refuse to accept from you the abuse and scolding and tirade you let loose at us. It still belongs to you, Brahman. It still belongs to you." And then he adds, "We do not partake of your meal. We do not enter upon an exchange. It still belongs to you." So I love that. And that's considered like an equanimous way to deal with an angry, abusive person. But I just love it. It's like, I'm not picking up when you're laying down or whatever. What's really interesting is there's different ways that the Buddha could have said all that, but at the end of the story, this guy is so impressed by the Buddha's response that he ends up ordaining and eventually becoming enlightened. Of course, with it. But obviously the Buddha said it in such a way that it didn't send the guy running in the opposite direction, but it actually got the guy and he realized. So I think that shows again that the metta was still the foundation, even though it was a very strong, clear response from the Buddha, like, "No, I'm not accepting your harsh words." But so I just love that example. And that's one way. And it also wasn't indifference. The Buddha was kind of acknowledging in a way that's not okay what you're doing, but he handled it his own way. So I just find that to be a very instructive story. Well, maybe I'll let all these quotes go for now. But thank you for your kind attention, and those are some ways of working with the Brahma Viharas.
Thank you so much. Guess we do have time for a question or two. Are you?
Yeah, that'd be great.
Anybody has comment or a question?
Happy to entertain any questions.
I'm feeling
Great.
Hey, Walt, thanks so much. It's great to have you back. Can you guys hear me? You can't hear me. Hey, Walt, can you hear me? Nod, yes, no?
I don't know
Okay,
how to change the speaker.
They could
okay,
type their question in the chat field if they want.
okay. That's all right.
Oh, there we go.
Okay.
Oh, you can hear me now? You
Yes.
can hear me?
Yes.
Great. So, Walt, thanks so much. It's great to have you back. I love the way like at the end there, you sort of gave two sides of the same coin. One was Like we can have goodwill towards other people, but we can't change whether they take it or, the outcome, and we have to let go of that. But at the same time, other people can't throw on us something and assume that we're going to take it, from the negative standpoint. And it sort of all reminds me of a quote. I don't know if Joseph Goldstein was paraphrasing the Buddha or not, but where he said, all beings are the heirs to their own karma. Their happiness or unhappiness depends on their actions, not upon my wishes. So yeah, thanks for introducing that at the end there. I really like that very much.
Yeah, thank you, Tom. And that is another phrase. That's another way of working with equanimity that Joseph's talking about there. If you need a phrase to practice your equanimity, you can use that phrase too about all the beings are heir to their karma. So thank you for bringing that in. Yes.
So on this Metta retreat, and Guy Armstrong was talking about karma, and it was really interesting because he said that at a certain point the Buddha was asked, does everything happen because of karma? And the Buddha replied, according to Guy Armstrong, no, everything happens because of the laws of causation, but karma is just one of those laws. And so others of the laws of causation are, I was like a list of 5 or 6, the weather and illness. And my father was a very angry person. He was very violent and hit a lot of people, including me and my sister, and sent my brother to the hospital and stuff. And I was very angry with him for much of my life. And fortunately, he died. It's the happiest day of my life when we buried him. And so I'm not angry with him as much anymore. But I reflected that, like, oh, he may have not been responsible for that. He was like injured in the war. And so like, that may be like another part of equanimity is, because it feels like when I hear that phrase about everyone is the heir of their own karma, it feels a little blamey to me, a little bit not compassionate, So I just wanted to share that.
Yeah. Well, I think of that as compassion as well, to see that your father's anger came from causes and conditions, and not that it made his actions okay, but you could at least have compassion that he obviously was suffering in some way that caused him to act like that, and that suffering came from whatever happened in his past. So I do think it's very helpful to see how those things work. My family believed in corporal punishment when I was a kid, so I would get spanked, and then I interviewed, and I was, even in recent years, was still kind of annoyed and my parents for thinking it was fine to spank me all the time. And but then I was talking to my father right before he died, and he told me stories about what his father did to him, which was way worse than anything he ever did to me. So in his mind, it was like he was he was lightweight or whatever. He was very gentle. So it's just I don't know. I mean, the other thing that the Buddha said was that people act out of ignorance, and sometimes, and that's helpful to remember too.
Do you find in working with people who had addictions that's like helpful as well to like know that their addictions may arise from many different reasons and stuff?
Definitely. I mean, trauma is usually underlies a lot of addiction because it's like self-medicating quite often in my experience. So we have to look at the trauma beneath, the addiction in a way. The Gabor Mate, doctor in Canada, says something like, we shouldn't be asking why the addiction, we should be asking why the pain. I find that very helpful in the addiction. A very compassionate way of looking at addiction. Yes.
So to sort of follow up on that a bit, and at this point dealing with the return to addiction from somebody that was important to me or is important to me. And so it occurs to me that the other thing that can easily happen, I think, is not just equanimity, but also anger. And so a piece of it is that compassion may also be that you're expecting to get something out of it, if only for a feeling of appreciation, and my compassion has been successful, and so forth. So I don't know what near enemy or whatever that is, but that's a potential issue that can rise.
But so the anger arises because you didn't get the response from the person you were trying to help.
So what appears to be compassion, it is compassion,
Right.
but there's also, so if you give somebody a gift and they don't seem to be appreciative,
Right.
even if you gave it to them out of the purest motives, seemingly, you may feel, I don't know if anger is quite the right word, but
Right. But
there's
that's
benefits in both directions.
and that's where our attachment is. It's not part of the Brahma Vihara of compassion. So that's
Right.
our little extra thing we're
But
adding
it could
there.
easily,
So
I
we have
think,
to see that.
go
Yeah.
along with it, not be noticed. It sounds like a near enemy in some way, but I can't define it.
Yeah, exactly. I hear what you're saying. Yeah. Joseph Goldstein tells us, speaking of him, he has a story about being in India and offering a young boy a banana. And he thought he was just being very kind and generous, but the kid just took the banana and ran away. Without any acknowledgement. He said he realized, hey, wait a minute. Like, he just thought the kid would at least say thanks. So he did have some attachment. I just think it's human nature in a way that we're going to have that. But in terms of the Brahma Viharas, we're trying to cultivate this sense of where we just do what we can and let go of the results. But again, it's not easy.